Okay, good morning. At least in Colorado, I think it's afternoon in 2 time zones across the U.S. I'm John Brackney. I'm your host. Joining us today is American history professor Stephen Tootle. Professor, will you just give a line or two on your what is it, curriculum vitae or your short bio? Who are you?
I'm an Okie from the Central Valley. Bachelor's in history, master's in history, PhD in history from Ohio University, where I studied under Alonzo Hamby. My first field was American political history. Second was American intellectual history. Third and fourth were European intellectual history and Soviet history. And my cognate field was in American literature. And I've written and participated. I've written about politics and participated in politics at the grassroots level for decades.
So now we all know why professors have curriculum vitaes and guys like me with a political science and a law degree have a short bio. So anyway, thank you for doing these, Professor. So today's topic is this is the most unusual show we've done so far because I just pitched out a big picture line or two to the professor. And I said, is it possible that we can talk about, is America a good and decent country? And of course, the subset of that is, are Americans good and decent? And I guess as for the professor style, it's not an opinion. Well, I'm good and I'm decent, therefore America is. We should base it somewhat on facts instead of just opinion. So ideally, the professor from his whole course of his career will be able to kind of give us some handholds to say, yes, well, I mean, I'm coming with the assumption that America is a good and decent country. It's broader than the topic that arose this week when 2 major elected officials of 2 different parties, is America a racist country? And both of them said, no, it's not. And a lot of my liberal friends came unglued at that, and they said, well, of course of course we're a racist country in America, and blank, 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 and blank. I still challenge that assumption that we're a racist country. I happen to agree with President Biden, and who was the one on the Democratic side? It was the vice president, right? It was the vice president who said we're not a racist country. And who was the other person? Help me out, team. You don't remember? This is like big news of this week.
No, I know. I don't remember. Sorry.
None of us do. Gosh, no wonder we have to have
it was
historians.
Senator. It was Tim Scott from South Carolina.
Tim Scott. Yeah, who said we're not a racist country, and then the vice president Kamala Harris said we're not a racist country. And again, my liberal friends came unglued at that, which I think is just really interesting. Anyway, this is a broader topic than that, although I bet it will come up. So, Professor, I have the premise that America is a good and decent country, and so are most Americans. Is that the right premise? And give a big picture if it is, or maybe you think we're not a good and decent country. Tell us.
Yes, I think America is a good, fine, decent country full of a lot of nice people. And there are a lot of different ways you can approach this question. The first I would say is that if you want to experience...
And hold one second, Professor. It looks like there's some background noise from one of us. So if you can put yourself on mute, whoever you are, that would be helpful. And then when we get to Q&A, we'll obviously take yourself off mute. Go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, Bob, Cheryl, and Eric are all unmuted. So approaching this question, is America a good and decent country? I guess I'm reminded of something the comedian Penn Jillette said. Do you know who Penn Jillette is? Penn and Teller. And he was sort of an expert in grifter. How do you steal from people? And he sort of said, if you ask somebody else, you'll always find an honest person. But if somebody is asking you, it's a grift. So he said, you could walk into any Starbucks in America and say, my wife's going into labor. Can I give you my car keys and my phone number? And will you take care of my car? And if you ask that person, you're going to find an honest person who says, yeah, absolutely, I'll take care of your car. You know, you can hand them essentially this thing that costs $40,000 and they'll take good care of it. But if you get a random email promising you money from Kenya, that's a grift. Then there's also the sort of human nature type of question, which is Americans are human beings, and we try to remind ourselves that every human being is capable of both good and evil, and all of the greatest evils in world history were all committed by people who thought that what they were doing was good. So that complicates our answer somewhat as well, which means that the system matters, because the system that we're in will encourage or discourage behaviors in the people who live there. And so if you look at all of American history, you kind of have to look at it in the aggregate and say, ask ourselves the three questions that Thomas Sowell said we should always ask: compared to what, at what cost, and where's your evidence? And I think the most important of those three questions for this is compared to what. So if you compare the United States of America compared to every other country during the years of our existence, and then you define good as the place in which the most people had most of their rights most protected, you would have to say that by that objective standard, the United States is a good place full of good people. And, as I mentioned before the recording started, I'm going on a long motorcycle ride next week. And if you want to know if people are good, take a motorcycle across America, because what you will find is that everyone you encounter is pretty nice and there to help you. Every other motorcyclist waves at you. And the further away from people who are crowded and in a hurry you get, the nicer people become. So you don't want to go to your local Costco when there's a run on toilet paper and then ask yourself, am I getting a good cross-section of humanity? Because people are desperate and crowded and angry. So it's important for us to not overemphasize those incidents where we see bad behavior, because that's not how most people are. And because most people aren't sociopaths, they also don't want to think of themselves as being bad people. So if you can encourage the good side in others, what you will find is that you will often encounter a good person.
Yeah, awesome. So Joe or Jacob, you're asking some hardball questions already, and let's hold those off for at least another 20 minutes, if you don't mind, because I've got a series of questions for the professor.
Those are good.
Two of them are hardball. So good at you for not being shy. So Professor, we've already done a whole show on this, so I don't want to take more than a minute or two. But when we talk about the goodness of America, it really starts out with our founding precepts, our why we're even here. Agreed? I mean, that's the major distinguishing characteristic, is we have a Declaration of Independence and a Declaration of War, but it's based off a morality document, not just a power document. And then it immediately, within a couple decades, create the Constitution, correct? Is that one of the great things we brought to the world, is the Declaration of Independence / Constitution / Bill of Rights / amendment process?
Yes, and I'd say it's even more profound than that, because the founders, by studying the big lessons of history, really identified elements of human nature that we're only now starting to understand using DNA and brain chemistry and evolutionary biology. And I always say, like, modern social science is all there to prove that Abraham Lincoln was right about Hamilton. That in other words, now that we understand, like, evolutionary brain, the parts of your brain evolved at different times, and how they function when you're engaging in certain kinds of behavior, you can go back and you look at the Federalists and you realize, like, aha, well, they understood that people can be inflamed by their passions and their emotions. So what they needed to do was set up a system so that we wouldn't be governed by our passions, that we would be governed by our rationality, and that our founders understood that you don't need to teach people security because people innately understand security. You need to teach people freedom. So we needed to have a political culture that emphasized pluralism and the protection of rights, because that's the part that takes work. In other words, you don't have to teach people to want more and to want to not be afraid of things like that. People get that pretty easily. People want to be safe and they want more stuff. You don't have to teach people that. You have to teach people, no, it might be hard, but you need to protect the rights of unpopular minorities. That is the thing that is, and by the way, the most unpopular minority might be rich people, because nothing is easier in a democracy than deciding, hey, let's take a vote. Should we take all of his stuff and divide it up between us? That's an unpopular minority. Realizing that the same rights that protect rich people and getting a political culture on that basis is also a political culture that will eventually begin extending rights and recognizing that it is good for society to protect the rights of everybody.
Okay. Thanks for that, going bigger, man. I wanted to talk Declaration of Independence and Constitution, and you went deep into philosophy and psychology and sociology. So thank you for that. So Professor, in the remaining 15 minutes before we go to Q&A, I had originally planned on writing 3 or 5 major occurrences in US history that would prove the positive of that statement, that Americans are a good and decent country and shared greatness with the world. And I kind of do have those. I also have some things that we should probably be pretty embarrassed about. And maybe they weren't unique to America, but there's still something when you look at them, you go, really? The Dred Scott decision. And that's just really, I don't even know how to make that look good. And so the follow-up question is then, have we repaired that to the best of our ability? Did we set it right? And then finally, there's some that I really don't even know if we should even get into. Is America a good and decent country? And I'm hesitant to even ask you this, but I'm giving you the 3 big buckets that I wanted to talk about. Dropping 2 nuclear warheads on cities. Boy, yeah, that's a great thing, or geez, that's a really hard decision, and good and bad, or no, that's just brutal to kill innocent people, women and children in their homes. I don't even know if we want to get to that part, those really hardball questions, but I will tell you, as a citizen who's spent my entire career professionally and avocationally and as a hobby, I don't think most Americans really talk about the morality of dropping nuclear warheads. I think we kind of just put that off to the side a little bit and say it probably saved more lives because we didn't have to fight for years. So where would you like to go on this? Do you want to talk about like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6? I have like 10 great things that America has given to the world. Or do you want to talk about some of the hard ones? Where would you like to go?
Well, I mean, I'm fine answering any of those questions. I guess the big answer to some of the things that you had already mentioned is that we will never be perfect because the fight for justice never ends. Because again, we are each because there's nothing about an individual human life that is static. So there's nothing about the lives of Americans in the aggregate that we could ever call static. Every event is a snapshot. It's a moment in time, and the struggle for justice in one's own individual life and the journey that you take as an individual in trying to achieve justice in your own life and around you is not something that you can ever say like, now I've got the gold trophy, I can put it up on my shelf and I'm retiring. And cultures are like that too. As far as I am interested in knowing what your big moments of goodness would be, and then the biggest questions you have about stuff like atomic bombs or slavery or Dred Scott or that sort of thing.
Well, let's take a couple of the big ones, big positives, at least in my mind. And I'm not, you may think this is naive from a non-historian to a historian. But I think one of the great gifts that America has given to the world, and I know that sounds arrogant, we did it for our own purposes, I get it, but is the sense of exploration. And I don't know if it's because there was this, massive continent between two oceans that we weren't sure what existed, but from the Louisiana Purchase all the way to exploration of Mars. I mean, this constant yearning that there's something new, there's something different. It is worth exploring, whether it's the oceans or the space or the molecular cell. I think America's been pretty darn good at being explorers, at constantly wondering and trying to solve problems and understand how the world works. And we're not exclusive. I'm not saying America is it, because there's lots of competition of ideas out there, but I'm saying we're pretty good at it. We're not just like isolationists and where we know we have the right answer and we're done. We're America, this is it, we're done. We don't need to know anything more. Americans are explorers. Agreed or disagree?
Well, I guess that's not one I would list for America, though, because I think that's more of a human trait that we've seen. And as I was going through my head, I was thinking about other expansive tendencies of different tribes, nations, nation states, and much of that motivation is an expression of often violence, but to put it mildly, often the result of a security arrangement within the culture of the specific tribe. So I just don't know if I would call that a specific American trait. So that's maybe why it wouldn't make my list. Yeah.
Fascinating. Let me try one more, and I don't think you'll agree with this either. You might agree with this one. We have made the determination that there are bullies out there, really bad dictators, totalitarian regimes, people that are willing to kill not only some individuals, but huge percentages of individuals, genocide, and brutal war. So we have made, and we don't talk about this as Americans much, which is why I'm curious of your answer. We have made the strategic decision over the last 75 years that we are going to spend inordinate amounts of money on controlling the atmosphere, space, putting up satellites and mission, and for military purposes, as well as civilian stuff. But for military purpose, we want to have the eyes on the world. And it's not just that, it's airplanes, it's aircraft carriers, and it's troops around the world. We want to make sure sea lanes are open and that pirates aren't going to just rob whatever country. That if we don't want something to happen, we more than anybody else has the ability to say, sorry, we're going to keep this sea lane open, or we're going to control this airspace and keep it open. We have made the declaration that we're going to control the world. You can't control the world, but as much as a country can. For some people would say capitalism, you're assuring me that we should say peace. That is something we're giving to the world. Agreed or disagreed?
I guess I'd call it a partial agreement, because what I would say is that the traditional American formulation was the correct one, and that the pre-Woodrow Wilson formulation that our foreign policy needed to be a combination of ideals and interests. That, in other words, if it was something that was in keeping with our ideals and it was in keeping with our interests, then we would act. But one of the I would say maybe darker versions of American foreign policy is that America should act in areas where it is in keeping with someone's proclaimed ideals, without tying it necessarily to any American interests. In the post-World War II era, we've entered into this kind of, new age where our legitimate security interests would extend around the world, because of the existence of the atomic bomb and in particular nuclear missiles. So I don't know how much kind of credit I give us for meeting a security threat, but I think you saved yourself with the end of your summary by saying that the end result of this is a kind of you didn't use this term, but a Pax Americana, a place where other countries can exist in the freedom and security arrangements that America is making possible for the rest of the world, which is, I mean, if you think about nothing else, and depending on how you judge what good is, the Pax Americana has resulted in the largest and the extension of the American system of free market, the using markets to incentivize behavior instead of violence, peace, has resulted in almost the elimination of global extreme poverty. So if you're somebody who cares about the elimination of poverty, and global extreme poverty is defined as, you might die if you don't get your next meal or your next needed dose of medicine type of poverty. And the fact that that's dropped dramatically, going from a world where 90% of the world lived in global extreme poverty to now that number is either 10% or even lower, because we have to kind of project on data from the last 7-ish years. But we don't. But the idea that we are virtually eliminating extreme poverty in the world is certainly maybe the greatest good ever performed on Earth.
That was my third one, so glad you brought that up. What was your one or two? What other ones do you want to throw out quick? And then I also want you to add, since we're short on time already, I want to add something fun, which is what America's brought to the world is entertainment and culture. And yes, there's some downsides to it. But my gosh, music and rock and roll and jazz and gospel and movies, and you can just go on and on. What we brought to the world, and for the most part, probably pretty positive. But give us a thing or two to hang on to. What else America's brought to the world? Then we'll go to a couple negatives.
Well, I think my big answer is probably the same as your third answer, which is what we would call American exceptionalism. The idea that keeping alive the idea that human beings are capable of governing themselves. So continuing to provide an example for the world that human beings are capable of living in a system where rights are protected. And being that example is probably the most positive good that any nation has ever bestowed upon the world. It's really hard to argue with that because the numbers are so incredibly stark. That wealth creation is possible, that we just an understanding that wealth creation is possible unleashes so much human potential, because you don't have to think of the world as being a place where you need to use violence in order to hoard resources for yourselves. So if you understand that wealth creation is possible, then you can, as I explain it to my classes, you can reject the logic of the Jeffersons song. You remember the TV show The Jeffersons, moving on to the East Side? But
I was thinking Jefferson Airplane, but yeah.
The Mr. and Mrs. Jefferson from the 70s. And the final line of it is, we finally got a piece of the pie. But one of the most destructive elements in all of human history is actually the last line of that song. This idea that somehow the wealth of the world is a pie, and what you have to do is to get a piece of it, and the larger your piece is, that means you're taking from someone else. And understanding that that's not the way life is, and that's not we only have 1,000 years worth of data on it, so who knows, but for the last 1,000 years we have data on wealth creation, and that in itself, that understanding makes it possible for people to live in peace. And so understanding that the resources of the world are not a pie that you need to use violence in order to divide up, allows us to live in peace with everyone else on earth. And what a profound blessing that is. And then and then it actually leads to your next point, which means that being a society that preserves rights means that we get to use everyone's talents. Everybody gets to focus on what they're good at or where their passions are. And that's where you're going to do your most creative work. You're going to work harder in something that you care about. And then you are going, because you've done that work, you have put that information into your own head, that will allow creativity to take place. And we will be combining information in creative ways and doing so freely because we are following our own conscience. And what that does is it just unleashes tremendous creative forces for the world. Because if you think about it, creating a society that says that we want the best contributions from society from just women. I mean, that's half the population of the world that were previously not able to, contribute to their fullest extent. But then the disabled, various ethnic groups and minorities who had been excluded along the way too. But saying to the world that we are going to allow every one of these groups to develop their gifts to their fullest extent has just unleashed the creative energies of the human experience. And I don't know how you could overestimate what that unleashes.
Cool. I screwed up facilitating this conversation, I guess, because it's already 11:29, and we really haven't talked about some of the big negatives that have occurred in America and our sins, so to speak.
We can sum them up quickly by saying these are the times when we fell short of our principles.
But give a couple of them though. What should we still be embarrassed about? And I've already mentioned one, the Dred Scott decision, and I don't think we need to go back to the 1619 Project. But there was a long element of history in America that is just pretty unpleasant, and some of it's still occurring today. And somehow it would be nice to bury that. And from 1857 to 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate versus equal to the Civil Rights Act. It just seems like that's been a slavery and indigenous population, and the Japanese internment. It just seems like there's kind of a trend in America that we really should try to figure out how to stop doing this. Right or wrong? Talk to us.
I would say absolutely right, but keep in mind, this is every time in American history when people were using the back of their brains instead of the front of their brains. This is every time you have a group of people in society that is concerned about preserving the status quo for themselves rather than protecting the rights of others. You obviously, we could have had a free system emerge in colonial Virginia in the years before the American Revolution, but the existing slave owners were trying to figure out a way, how do I keep power? How do I keep all of my land without, but I want cheap labor, but I can't keep oppressing Englishmen, so I'm going to buy labor that is for sale because it allows me to keep my status, and thus, and the rest of the South, followed suit. But a lot of it comes from those critical decisions made in the years after Bacon's Rebellion. By a class of people who simply did not want their status in society challenged by protecting and allowing for the protecting of rights of others. And the same can be said of every decision that flowed afterwards. The Dred Scott decision is essentially an extension from that, because what do you get in the years after? More entrenched interests who want to protect what they have. And the Japanese internment would be yet another example, although there's some nuance to the Japanese internment because there was a war, and another way of looking at, again, in history, or if you want to have a more fruitful discussion, you have to say compared to what, at what cost, and where's your evidence. So imagine the security arrangements for what that would have been like in the Soviet Union or in Germany at the time, the reason, if you're looking on the bright side, the reason we have a bad Supreme Court decision, the Korematsu Supreme Court decision, which is roundly denounced now as an incorrectly decided Supreme Court decision. But the reason you have a Supreme Court decision is because those Japanese citizens could sue for their rights. And at least we had a system that worked them through the courts. And yes, the court ultimately came up with a wrong decision. But if you're comparing it to what else was going on in the world at the time, it was, you don't necessarily, it's less fruitful to compare what's going on in your society with a utopia in your own mind. And it's better maybe to, or more useful to compare it to the reality of what was happening in the world at the time. Especially when it comes to, it's just not overly fruitful to, morally condemn the people of the past. I just don't think you get much from it. I don't know what the point is, really. They're dead. I don't know if it makes you feel good or something, but
it's probably worth a whole show to itself, because it's coming up more and more frequently, it seems.
There's certainly, I mean, almost everything, every sin, as I said earlier, comes back to not living up to the principles of the Declaration.
But I almost want to end there, but I guess I should at least allude to, there's a bunch of other stuff I didn't get to, but hopefully some of our participants today will ask their questions. For example,
you didn't ask me some of the goods,
Yeah.
Because as we were
Jump in
talking,
quickly.
I was thinking of these moments where I don't give people a lot of credit when they are doing something that is necessary for security arrangements. So I often think of, what are the times when people acted to preserve a political culture when it would have been easier not to do so? So as you were talking, I started thinking of George Washington and the Newburgh conspiracy. This is a moment when the revolution was at the precipice. His officers were demanding pay, and Washington steps in front of his officers, gives a speech, and says that essentially turns the revolution around in that moment. And you realize that was a moment when it would have been easier for any demagogue to say, you know what, you're right, let's go, I'm your leader, let's turn on, and be the democratic demagogue, populist leader leading the charge of the military against the government. And our government would have ended up just like every other revolutionary government, this sort of in a cycle of populist demagogues. Thaddeus Stevens, or Frederick Douglass, but I was, the other moment I thought of was when Franklin Roosevelt took office during the Great Depression. Walter Lippmann, the great journalist, wrote him a letter saying, you may have to assume dictatorial powers. And this is a moment in history when, if Franklin Roosevelt had had different heroes, he might have simply become the dictator of the United States. But because his heroes were Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, you can criticize him for going as far as he did. I certainly do think that he went too far, but he didn't make himself Mussolini. And that is a strength to the political culture of the United States. And then I've got a couple of curveballs. Another moment was, and I'm sure nobody would remember this, but there was a kind of second tier wide receiver for the Cleveland Browns, whose last name was Hawkins, Andrew Hawkins, maybe. So I'm sure somebody could Google it. But I remember he wore a shirt that said "Justice for Tamir Rice and John Crawford." And, going back to 2014, this would have been more controversial than it would be now. And after the game, reporters kind of stick a microphone in the guy's face and they start asking him questions. And he gave one of the most articulate defenses of the American system I think I've ever heard. And this is a, wide receiver for the Cleveland Browns. And I remember watching it and I got I remember getting choked up at the time, but I was also just in awe that this guy, oh, thank you. There's the link. But if you can find the YouTube video of his statement, I just remember thinking at the moment, like, this is America at its best. This is America. This is an American who understands what America is and is simply saying, we want justice according to the principles of the Declaration. No more, no less. And the way in which he did it was just incredibly powerful. And I just couldn't believe that it was off the cuff. I mean, you see how I stumble and bumble and inarticulate I am at times. And you just watch this, probably, I bet the whole thing takes 5 minutes. And you'll never hear a better 5-minute summary of what America is than Andrew Hawkins, Cleveland Browns wide receiver, explaining his T-shirt.
Awesome. You said there was a couple. That was one. You have another one?
Well, I was thinking of Franklin Roosevelt and
okay.
George Washington. I would also say just maybe Lincoln in that moment before the Civil War, where he sits down to scribble out what we call the apple of gold or fragment on Constitution and Union, where he sits down and he says that, I need to get my head straight here, that what I'm doing here is I'm saving the ideals of the Declaration via the Constitution of the United States, and that we have to act so that we preserve both of those things. Not one, not the other. It has to be both.
And Professor, I want to add in one more that I didn't get to, and you don't need to respond to this per se, but maybe you can work it into Q&A. The spoils of war. Throughout most of humanity, the victor goes the spoils, and the U.S. has done kind of a good job. I mean, the Marshall Plan and what we did in Japan afterwards, I mean, we conquered, and then we rebuilt their society, helped them rebuild their society. I think that's a noble venture. And I know a lot of my conservative friends say that we got to stop spending our 1% of our federal budget and helping, countries around the world. I get it, but I still think that's a feather in our cap, a victory that we care beyond our own selves. And yes, there's national interests in why we do it. We're not totally pure. We're looking after ourselves as well. But I still think we do a lot of things for the right reasons. Agree or disagree? And then we'll go to Q&A.
Totally agree. Nobody goes to sleep at night fearing a New Zealand terrorist. I mean, the understanding. I mean, I would sometimes ask my classes this, and they would always laugh. Like, do you worry? If I were to ask you if you're worried about the British invasion, most people would think of the Beatles. They wouldn't be worried about England actually invading the United States. And the reason is because one of the greatest, again, gifts of the 20th century is the understanding that when another country is safe and prosperous and free, that is to our security advantage. We as a country want other nations to be safe and prosperous and free, because we've never gone to war with a country that was safe and prosperous and free, and no two countries that are safe and prosperous and free have ever gone to war. So if you're one of those people who cares about world peace, what you should care about is that every country on earth is safe and prosperous and free.
Love it. That's a good way to go to Q&A. With your permission, friends, I'm going to give it to Frank again, because he's our longtime listener, first-time caller, or whatever you're supposed to say on that. Frank, do you have any questions, or you want to be patient?
No, I want to really respond to Jacob's questions, which are quite, intriguing to me.
Okay, so you want to respond or you want the professor to respond?
I want to discuss. I want the professor to respond.
Okay.
So goes-
Okay, well then hold on if you don't mind. I want to have Jacob, you're new to me. Do you know Jacob, Professor?
Mm-mm.
And Jacob, I can't remember how I know you. If I prefer that you ask in your own language. I know you've typed a lot, but what is your most important question or two or point for the professor? If you can take yourself off mute and ask away.
Okay, I don't know where to start. Let's see. First of all, when you're talking about goodness can only exist when there's a complete ending of all activity that we refer to as evil. For example, let me tell you, if I do many great things, let's say for your family, let's say I get you a job, let's say I buy you a house, I buy you a car, I make sure you get the best of education, I pay for it for you. That's all good things. However, if I then kill your wife, rape your daughter, kill your dog, do you say to yourself, well, you know, he did do those bad things, but actually he's a good guy? No, I don't think you would say that. So in the same way, the United States has done great and wonderful things, but at the same time, they have done things which totally negate this nation and make it an evil, corrupt. It is number one. It is a fact. I've done the research. There is no other nation, compare every other nation on the planet. China and Russia are probably their top competitors. When was the last time Russia, or let me put it this way, how many countries has Russia and China bombed, invaded, bombed, occupied, and decimated the nation and left it in ruins like we have in, let's say, in the past 20 years?
You want to know how many?
Okay. Yeah, well, I think you've given a philosophy and a specific question. Is that enough to hang on to give some response to, Professor?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say, number one, I reject the premise of the question because it conflates the individual with the aggregate. And then I would also say that it's incorrect for the individual and it's incorrect for the aggregate. If you're an individual, the implication is also that there is no redemption in life, and that you can't simply improve yourself. That and there's an implication that somehow both as an individual and as a group, that, as I said before, that life is stagnant, that you are a snapshot of yourself on any given day. People grow and people change. The next thing I would say about, you asked a question about taking over other countries and numbers of deaths. Between the Soviet Union and China, you have close to 100 million murders in the 20th century, with Mao responsible for 65 million murders. And there's simply nothing else in human history that compares to that in terms of being mass murder in all of human history. And number two would be Stalin and Lenin.
Okay, so let's do the following, okay?
Hold on one second. Hey, Darren, are you on? Can you mute yourself, Darren or Eric?
So
Go ahead, Professor.
just in terms of the raw numbers, the other thing to remember is that both China and the Soviet Union are empires that conquered all of the countries around them. They're both land empires. So again, in the last 100 years, there is no, there are no countries that would even come close to the number of nations conquered by the Russians and the Chinese. And I can't name all of the stands that they've done it both to, but it's certainly, you don't get to cover 11 time zones as the Soviets did without conquering. I mean, just what they conquered and didn't give up and were holding by force in Eastern Europe, and then in that next line of countries, and continued to hold. It's just not even close.
So Professor, Jacob's first question and his last one has not the U.S. been terrorist nation #1 in the world for decades? And then he asked it again later, talk about the Holocaust that the USA is perpetuating today. I must admit, those don't resonate with me, so I'm not sure what he's talking about. Do you have a response to those questions? Because that's what he typed.
I guess what I'd be interested in knowing is, what is your definition of terrorism, and what Holocaust would you be talking about?
Okay, let's go. I'm curious on this, so let's go ahead, and we've got other topics, of course. But Jacob, why don't you ask it again? Have that make sense to us.
Or what's your Jacob? What's your definition of terrorism, and what is your what Holocaust are you talking about?
Jacob, can you unmute yourself? I'm trying to help you as well, but I don't see it working yet. There you
Yes,
go.
can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, any form of violence, man upon man, any form of violence is terrorism. Okay, so now, and my definition of Holocaust is, if you even murder one person, that is a Holocaust. If you take the life of one person, that is a Holocaust. Holocaust is not when you murder 20 million or 50, no, it's a Holocaust is when you go, I mean, what we did currently, what we're doing now, currently, Yemen, we are destroying that nation. We are supplying, second, we are supplying weapon aid to Israel that is right now, as we speak, terrorizing the people of Palestine. We destroyed in the past 10 years, we destroyed Libya. Libya had the highest standard of living of all, one of the highest standards of living of all the African nations. And Gaddafi was helping the Black people of Africa. And we decimated that country. Name one example when Russia or China did that. We destroyed Iraq for no reason. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. We destroyed it for no reason. We went into Afghanistan. We bombed it. They're still there in Afghanistan. It was bombing and killing in Afghanistan. We tried to bomb and destroy Syria, but thank God Russia came in and interceded and saved the lives of the people of Syria. If it wasn't for Russia, the United States would decimate Syria as well.
All right, Jacob, thank you so much. You gave 5 different examples.
Okay.
Of what he's talking about. So now you know how to hang your hands on, Professor.
So
go ahead.
If we take his definition that I guess I would reject his definition of a Holocaust. I think it's a specific historical term. But if we take his definition of terrorism as being any act of violence, it is true that acts of violence alter behavior, and that at the heart of all terrorism is violence. And so at least that's something I can kind of hang my hat on. But you can't use absolute numbers because any country with a larger population is going to have more acts of violence. So, I mean, I guess you could take a measure, if you believe the statistics that are coming out of individual countries. You could measure how many acts of violence on a per capita basis, and judge, civilizations in that regard. But I would simply point out that the United States and countries with systems that are closer aligned with classical liberalism in the aggregate are all much less violent. And there is much less violence now than there was 80 years ago. And as far as the examples of things that the Russians or the Chinese are doing right now, Russia is at war with the Ukraine right now. They are currently engaged in a war that is they are occupying Crimea right now. And the Chinese are conducting what I think can fairly be called a genocide against the Uyghurs, where they have singled out a specific population for cultural extermination, complete with internment camps and mass raping of the women as a policy of exterminating them as a people. So there's simply nothing that the United States is currently doing that would compare to what Russia is doing in Ukraine, or that China is doing with the Uyghurs.
So I think you've answered the question at least satisfactorily for a short time frame. Thank you, Professor.
Okay.
Other teammates, what are your questions? Is America a good and decent country, or Americans good and decent? What are your questions? Did we give you enough handholds to ask your own question now? Take yourself off mute, and I'll call on you. No one? Well, this will be a first, Professor, if
I
we've
know,
stunned
never had
everybody
this
into
happen.
silence.
Yeah. I did such a good job answering the questions, I guess, that
Well, I'm going to do one fluff question just while we're waiting to see, and I'll watch to see you take yourself off mute. Go a bit on let's see, yeah, go a bit on culture and music, and is there something that you think is it Hollywood? And we often attack Hollywood for being like liberal and ruining our morality. But is there some goodness to Hollywood and Nashville? And is gospel or jazz? What have we given to the world as far as culture?
well, certainly jazz is a unique art form, but I would also add that popular music and popular culture is another strength of the United States. And if you think about what it takes, the artistic talents combined with the craft necessary to make a Hollywood movie. And what was produced at first in the United States, obviously other countries have film industries, large and successful film industries now. But if you think about what it took to produce a single Hollywood movie in the year 1965, the skilled craftsmanship of every device, every camera, every lens, the skill of the person using it, the fact that you had not just one composer, but all of the best composers in the world, all of the best lyricists in the world, all of the best singers in the world. And what this division of labor allowed for was the creation of incredible pop culture. Another example of this might be to look at Frank Sinatra, a single Frank Sinatra album with Quincy Jones doing the arrangements and the musicians who participated in it, all to the best songwriters and the best lyricists with the best singer, and in every way, this is only allowed when you are in a free society where everyone is allowed to contribute. I mean, or another example of this would be, you take just one song like Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys. If you think about what it took to make that song, from the quality of the microphones to the quality of the engineering that went into the soundboard, it's a pretty remarkable accomplishment, everything that's in that little snippet of music.
Cool. Thanks for adding that. Somebody got a question, or I'm going to go to my next one. Frank, you trying to speak?
Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah. So, one of the things that troubles me the most about this process we're going through, which I value this education process, and I believe so much in the fundamental good of the United States and what it's brought to the world. And then I see Jacob's comments, and he feels emphatically and from the heart that we're on the wrong foot from the get-go. And how can I, Professor Tootle, how can I believe so strongly in the overall good of what self-governance, the proof of self-governance and the ability to build wealth and the importance of the rule of law and all of these things, and how it's brought so much more to the world? There's been consequences to it, but we've brought so much more to the world, and it's worth it. And yet Jacob feels, I believe he feels, that we should just, we should all just go and jump into the ocean or something, kill ourselves and let something else start, because we just got it wrong right from the beginning. This was crazy talk that we had something good here.
Well, I mean, I guess I can start answering, if he made three more questions here, but first he's asserted that the people of Crimea voted to be a part of Russia, but that's
Professor, if you don't mind me interrupting, I actually think Frank's question is different. It's not on the specifics. It's culturally, how can two people, representative of many more people, take a look at the same facts and reach the exact same result and hate each other over? And I'm not saying you hate Frank or that Jacob hates, but how are we so divided? How do we start convincing each other again in rational conversation rather than just taking two diametrically opposed? Frank, I don't think you mean the specific, right? You mean in general, what's wrong with us as a people?
Right, I
okay.
agree.
Well, I guess I would say one of the things that is to take their questions seriously, knowing that you're never going to, one interaction is never going to convince anybody of anything. So I don't know Jacob, but I can pretty much guarantee you that he's not going to believe anything I say and change his mind about all these maybe deeply, I assume, deeply held assumptions about the way the world works. But that's sort of not the point. And I revert back to how Eisenhower and Lincoln approached these issues, because in many ways they were facing, how do you convince a bunch of people to protect the rights of Black people when they don't want to? That's hard. So they both realize that what you have to do is encourage what is good in people and encourage them to take the next step, whatever that next step might be. And you really can't do more than that, because it's impossible. You can't force somebody to change their minds, and you can't argue with somebody into changing their minds. When he says facts, irrefutable, undeniable, observable facts. Well, the fact that communists killed 100 million people or thereabouts, we don't know within 10 million people how many people communists killed in the 20th century. That should tell you how many people they killed. But that's a fact. And it's a fact in human history that it happened. And if you get people to acknowledge reality and define their terms, you can actually have productive conversations with people. That's why it's, you'll notice that when I was asking Jacob, I was like, what's your definition of, there was almost no point in answering his question until I knew what he meant by a Holocaust. Because we had different definitions of the word Holocaust, I would have never addressed his actual question, because he was defining a Holocaust as any act of violence. And so I would have given some answer that had nothing to do with that. So I think the first thing that you have to do in order to have any kind of a productive conversation is ask people what they mean by the words that they use, or ask them, what would they accept as a fact? What would you accept as a source? Because I can't, if you simply say, well, I reject the fact that 100 million people were killed by communists in the 20th century. You say, okay, well, or you say the people of Crimea voted to be a part of Russia. And you say, well, would you have accepted on this basis that the people of the South should have been able to vote to separate from the United States in the Civil War? That's not really how representative governments work. So you can't simply vote to leave a country. Or you say, okay, well, I guess in your worldview, the South should have been able to have their own slaveholding republic in order to maintain the moral purity, I guess, of the North. Or if you want to say the USA was founded on genocide, I would say, all right, well, I need to know what you mean by a genocide, because most definitions of genocide would be something that was purposeful and targeted. And 90% of the Native Americans died before any Englishman hit the United States. So to the idea that somehow the United States of America, founded in 1776 to 1789, was responsible for the 90% of the deaths that took place 250 years earlier, that's a fact. That's 2.5 centuries of time that has passed. So I don't know if that is enough to convince someone, but all I can do is continue to point that stuff out and say, well, the USA wiped out millions of Indians, but in most of the Native American deaths that took place, there's also a distinction to be made between the actions of individual settlers that were responsible for most of the deaths, and then the actions of the US government. It's kind of like you get this kind of question sometimes when you deal with something like Hawaii. How did Hawaii come into the United States? Well, most of what happened in Hawaii was Americans who left the United States, or the Mexican-American War, or what happened between Texas and Mexico. That wasn't the United States government. That was Americans who left and then did something, for instance. But none of that means that the American government didn't also have terrible policies with regards to Native Americans. But I just don't know that those moral questions are quite as clear as you would want to indicate, because in most cases, and this is, I guess we should just, and this is a good point to maybe end on, is there's a downside to pluralism and there's a downside to democracy. And the downside to democracy is that everybody gets represented. And when we have a democratic form of government, what you should be more, I guess what you should be more impressed with is how is it that a nation full of people who were personally racists decided to protect the rights of people that they were prejudiced against? That's a more incredible story, that the principles were powerful enough to pull the culture along. We shouldn't be shocked that the world is made up of full of people who, you're born, you have this innate recognition of your mother when you're born. You are born with the desire, you associate people who look like you with security. That's something that you're born with. So we shouldn't be shocked when people organize themselves in security arrangements based on their family and their extended family. That's what all of world history was. All of world history was clan, tribe, nation. And nations were nothing but a bunch of tribes. Tribes were nothing but clans, and clans are interrelated families. And that's what every country was like before the United States. Security arrangements based on family relations. So the founding of an ideological nation state, the first ideological nation state, based on the idea that you should want to protect the rights of people who are not your family. That is unique in all of human history. And that is what pulled us away from this human tendency to only want to protect the rights of ourselves, or I shouldn't even say rights, protect the interests of ourselves and people who are in our immediate families and people who look just like us. So the ability to protect the rights of others, that's the precious thing that has led to so many good things in the world.
So from a big philosophical statement, I think that is an excellent way to end, Professor. But I hope I don't take away from that statement so we can cut and paste me out. But Frank, I want to give you a slightly different answer, and it's a practical one. I think when people of goodwill who are earnestly trying to understand how the world works and how people think and how we can make it a better place, I have a specific. When I first read the 1619 Project in the New York Times, I posted on it in Facebook. I thought it was an interesting read. I liked it because it gave me some knowledge that I wasn't particularly familiar with. And then, I don't know, 6 months later, I read a little article or a blurb from Professor Tootle ripping into part of the 1619 Project of the New York Times. And now I had to reconsider that a little bit. I'm still sorting through the lack of knowledge that I got from my public school education regarding race and race relations, because it really, I don't think what I learned as an elementary, junior, or high school in Littleton, Colorado, is actually accurate. And Professor Tootle talks about that. And so how do we learn new things so we can engage in better ways? And so hopefully we're making a small contributing effort towards that by learning. Every time Professor talks, I learn something new that I go, I really should go read a book on that. I should delve a little deeper into that.
Well, and I would just say, Frank, I'm learning from you every week. Bart, I'd say the same. Ben, not so much, but no, but you know, this thing that we're doing, I mean, you're doing it. You're answering your own question every week, in a way.
Okay, we're way over time, but I always like to be as magnanimous, if that's a word. It is a word, but I don't know if it's the right word. Ben, Frank, Bart, Eric, or Darren, any lightning round? You have a quick, I mean, like 5-second question and a 10-second answer. Anything? Okay, thank you for joining us today. Did you see one, Professor?
No, I just want to thank Jacob, because I think one of the important things is, like, I want Jacob to come back. You know, I want him to continue to ask the hard questions. I think that one of the things that we will always run into is, you know, we don't want this to become the hallelujah chorus. Like, we want the hard questions, and we should always want them. I always tell, you know, if this was my students, when I say, if you don't know what to ask, just ask. Compared to what, at what cost, or where's your evidence? Because those are the 3 questions I should always be prepared to answer. So always demand of yourself, you know, the same level of scrutiny. And I would also point out this book by Charlene Nemeth called In Defense of Troublemakers. Like, the value of authentic dissent in any organization is profound. So you absolutely, if you want your organization to be good, if you want your organization to produce good work, you need someone within that organization who is offering you authentic dissent.
Awesome. That's a great way to end. Team, the next week we're taking off because the professor is probably motorcycling across his great state or country. But the following week, I think we're going to do immigration. And then within another week or two, we're going to have a military historian expert on the history of the military in the United States. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day, everyone. Your words are important, and we appreciate you being a part of our team. Have a great day. I'm going to stop the recording.